Three things I wanted to cover. One was a really simple feature toggle mechanism. Second was a little script I use to make sure the Xcode project file is kept in order. And the third one is a really simple way of contract testing your API using Swagger, which follows on nicely. I think Jesse last month, the month before, gave something on using Swagger to define API contracts. So yeah, these are just a few things I was doing. So we try and use feature toggles heavily on the app that we work on. We've got 7 developers contributing constantly to the app, and you get horrible merge conflicts. So we try and merge all the time, and if work is in progress, we just try and hide that functionality until it's ready to display. So just imagine we have a really simple app that just has... It's not Xcode 9 purely because that's not what I had open when I decided to put this together.
I was going to ask you to enlarge it. You can't do that in Xcode 8.
It's already large. Here's one I prepared earlier. Oh!
There's a seat up the front for you, Matt.
Yeah. So, just imagine this is an awesome demo app, and we just have an unfinished feature. So often when you're working on a chunky feature, it's really nice if there's a single entry point to it. So we might have this unfinished feature that does something. It's not finished yet. We won't all see it while we're developing it, but if we push out builds to our stakeholders, we don't necessarily want them coming up and asking questions why this is broken, why it's not finished. It just saves a whole lot of effort, and it means that we can merge really often. So I want to merge this in, but the feature's not there. So we might say something like, we want to hide the button if if we're not in debug mode, then we might want to hide it. So we might say something like should show the thing. The thing is called do your thing because I was listening to James Brown on my headphones while I was writing this, and so we might say this is. We'll just set that to the toggle. We set it as a variable because we use dependency injection to actually test it. So because it's good to even test your view controllers. So we might just say the button.isHidden. We'll say it this, the should show you thing enabled, and because you do hidden not visible like every other language, you have to put a not in there. It's a bit confusing. So now, so glad I'm using my MacBook Pro. I've got a little MacBook I used for writing code on the train, and I get 3 goes at compiling the app on my whole train trip home. It takes so long. So I'm going to replace it with an iPad because it's got faster chips now. So we still see it, but if we run it in release mode, hopefully it'll be gone. But you know how live demos go. All right, so we can all dev on it, all the other people can see it, we can collaborate on it, we can merge it in, but if we push out a build to our stakeholders, it's hidden. Sometimes you want to do that, you want to fetch them remotely from the API, but often just having toggles compiled into your app is completely fine, and it's really low overhead. So that's how we use the toggles. In terms of how they're defined, it's really simple. We basically say, so our set of toggles is basically just, we create a toggle and we just say which types of builds it's enabled for. So we've got our builds matched to like build configurations in Xcode, but you could define it however you want. And we just have an array of it. So if we want to say, actually we want this in release as well, we could just set that, and then it'll be enabled even in our release builds. And once things are enabled everywhere and you're pushing it out to all your stakeholders and you're happy with the feature, delete the toggle. It's a real nightmare if you just let this build out to hundreds of things. There you go. So now it's even in release builds. So, yeah.
Is that sort of debug common release and option set?
Interestingly, I thought I would be a really clever Swift developer and do it as an option set. And I spent about half a day on it and realized it could have been like 2 minutes of not clever Swift.
So it's an array of things.
It's just an array of build configs. So you could do it with if-defs, but they're really hard to test. So don't riddle your code with that. So we basically have a single place where we say, these are the types of things we want to toggle on. As I said, we're using build configs, you could use anything else. And so we have debug and release. In fact, in our production app, we have a number of these. We have kind of a dev build, we have a QA build, and some other things. And we set API environments, other things based on that. And so this is the one place in our code where we use the if-def just to define what the active build configuration is at compile time. But everything else just depends on that. So, and then our toggle code is literally just saying if the active build configuration is one of the ones we've enabled it for, that's really just an array contains. So we basically look at that array, the debug, comma release, whatever, and we just say if our current build config is in that array, then it's enabled, otherwise it's not. And it conforms to a protocol because we use fake ones that we inject for testing. So if we want to test this thing, we'll say, let's create our storyboard. And then I don't like using like implicit optional unloading, whatever, unwrapping, except in tests. If your tests crash, like just fix it. It's fine. So, and I don't have Apple's clever snippets tool, so I just put this stuff down here. Yeah, so I basically say the reason we put it as a property was so we can set it in the test. So we can just say, when it's toggled off, then it should hide what we're doing, and when it's toggled on, we should do it. Obviously in production, there's slightly different ones. Did I call it something else? Ah, there you go. There you go. This is what happens when you sometimes listen to James Brown and sometimes you're just a bogan Aussie. Here? No, somewhere else.
There was another in the same file before.
Ah, there you go.
You could have used it.
So I heard a guy last year talk about mob programming. I guess this is like extreme mob programming. We could write a book and become agile thought leaders. There you go. So that works. So I'm a fan of testing view controllers, and I'm a fan if you're going to introduce build like feature flags of actually testing the different permutations, because otherwise it's really easy to like it works for me and then you push it out to people and it's broken. So yeah, that's really basic feature toggles. It's literally, 3 lines of code there, maybe 10 lines of code there, 10 lines of code there, and you're done. And so we have maybe 10 of these things in our code base at any one time, in just static defs there, and once they're pushed out and they're released, we delete them.
I'll ask you a question why you're a fan of testing view control.
I'm a fan of being able to write code and push out an app and being confident that it's not broken. So that's one way of gaining that confidence. We don't have automated UI tests on my project at the moment, and we don't have a QA. So that's a good trade-off for us. It may be different in different environments. And we also kind of practice continuous delivery as much as you can in the iOS space, in that we push out builds to our stakeholders for every single commit that merges in. So, yeah, as they get more complicated, the trade-off might be different. And also, if your view controllers are really lean and you've extracted all your logic, there may be limited value in it as well. So,
Since you've opened the can of worms around testing view controllers,
that wasn't the intention of this talk.
all the tough one. So, how do you get around problems such as initializing your view controller without a whole heap of boilerplate and switching from a production or a staging environment across to a test environment? I know.
There is some boilerplate involved in setting it up, but not many. Like if we have a view controller that you're injecting 10 dependencies into, it's probably a smell that we could actually abstract smaller concepts within that. So actually test driving them it makes you feel pain when things get more complicated. So I think that's not a terrible thing.
And to that point, actually, my brain think of it, like, Thomas said it, I don't know, I can't remember now. There's a blog post people have recently learned to relive the diff IoT with it. They use the factories to help avoid task-like dependency between people.
Yeah. And with default parameters, it's also quite, like we do a lot of things where we inject all our dependencies, but they have default parameters. So our code at runtime, the actual production code, is kind of just creating objects, and you're not having to inject a lot of things. It's like poor man's dependency injection, but it's better than 1,000 lines of XML, which is what we have in our Java code bases. 1,000 lines, that's probably really...
Just one more thing, I think you did mention that, but just again, you're using vars, which is basically compiled code. What is the advantage of using compiled code versus using the hash ifs?
So basically what I did here, so if you had, in the view controller, if we did if debug, hash if debug, whatever, then we couldn't do this test. So we would actually have to run the app in multiple configurations to know that we'd wired it up right. And I could go a whole day without actually running the app in the simulator, just running the tests. And that's, if I can do that and push it and still be confident that the app works, that's a win. Sometimes I do that and it's completely broken and I think I really should have run the app. But that's a goal of mine, just because it's so much quicker.
To go further on that topic of why not to use if-this, the problem with if-this is that you're introducing a matrix of compile time variables. So the more if-this you introduce into your application, the more potential the matrix gets exponentially larger. And so you end up you'll have a refactor of some code because there was some code path that's in the else condition that's not normally compiled, whatever, you dismiss it.
Yeah.
You want to avoid preprocessor if conditions.
Yeah, that's the other thing. So the things in those if-def, if it's in the else, like if you look at the build config thing, so this is the only line actually getting compiled at the moment. This one isn't. So if we make this something else, the app will still okay. In Objective-C it didn't. Is that?
It's working. It's a little different because it actually has to be syntactically valid.
Right.
But
Doesn't have to be functionally
it
valid.
doesn't have to be functional.
Yeah, right.
In C compilers, it doesn't even have to be syntactically valid.
Yeah. In terms of compiling them in, that's really just a trade-off. So we have a mechanism for doing remote feature toggles as well, but because our app's not in production yet, it's a bit more overhead to manage remote feature toggles, so we don't have a need for it yet. We're doing a lot of just-in-time architecture, so until we need it, we won't do it. So these kind of 20 lines of code satisfies our need now. Once you're in production with 1 million users, it's a different trade-off, and you have to maintain the toggles in a different way. Anyway, that's the first thing I want to look at. The second one was, does everyone use xcconfigs for managing their build variables? Yep, cool. The less stuff in the project file, the better, because it's horrible to maintain. So,
If you're not using xcconfigs, you should.
yeah, really simple to set up. So I basically have this shell script that passed. It just didn't output anything. That's a hacky shell script that I wrote about 6 or 7 years ago, and
We use that over
yeah, and it still works. It basically greps the project file for build settings and does it. But I actually decided if a bash script gets longer than about 3 lines of code, I spend so much time Googling the syntax that it's quicker to write it in Ruby. And then you just have the one-off cost of setting up all your Ruby dependencies, which can take days on a Mac. And then you realize that, in speaking of automation, Xcode build has this one bit where it does the export options plist and does that kind of stuff, which has got really good in Xcode 9. It shells out to a Ruby script that relies on system Ruby and system gems that are defaulted on your system. And
Does it still do that?
I did in Xcode 7 and 8. I haven't checked on 9. And I went through it with in the testing lab at DubDub in 2015, and I think the engineer's comment was, effing Ruby. Anyway, so the main thing is we want to extract everything to xcconfigs, but Xcode loves to add settings into here automatically, and you don't realize it. And some people don't look at their commits before they push it to Git. I don't know why. It's a weird psychological behavior that some developers seem to have. So instead of constantly being passive aggressive, we'll just say here's a script that tells you no. So you can run this shell script and it says no. But it was really hard to work out what it was. I'm not very good with shell stuff. So the Ruby one will hopefully tell us what it was. There you go. It says for the configuration debug, we set the target device family. We accidentally switched off iPad support for that. So just to get an idea of what those scripts are, this is the hacky shell script I wrote 7 years ago. Amazingly, it still works, but it's literally grepping the project file, so if they change it, it's going to break. So I outsourced that responsibility to Ruby and the Xcode project gem. It's more code, but it's easier to understand.
I did the same thing recently, and then Hugo before he complained that it was too damn slow, and put the grep back in.
I mean, this is a very simple project, so maybe you're right.
No, I think the problem I had actually was that instead of using rake, which is much faster than start, we built a Fastlane action to it. And
Fastlane is slow.
much slower.
Yeah.
And so it was taking like a second or two to run that script, so every build would pause for a couple seconds just to check it.
It was booting up a web browser as well. Booting up a web browser to scrape the.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sends all of your source code to Google. You know that.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
But in the end, all you want to do is protect.
So anyway, if you do use XC configs and you get frustrated with trying to like control where your settings are being done and the state of your project file, it's really easy just to have a script that does it to enforce it. This is more code than the shell script, but it's easier to understand if you like Ruby. I think Ruby is a really nice language to read, but if you don't know it, you might not agree. I heard the comment that actually Ruby prioritizes like the beautiful nature of the language at the expense of everything else you'd want in a programming language. Which is probably true, but people still manage to write software in it. People write software in JavaScript. So, speaking of JavaScript, okay, so that's the second thing. The writing little scripts like that. I'm sure you've all got a bunch of them in your project. It's probably really useful to share them all, and we could all benefit. You might.
Scripting these sorts of things, so I don't know if anyone's made a marathon yet. I haven't, but it's something Johnson Dell's written as well. He's pretty prolific. Obviously spotlight over what I should do. But he's written a tooling, like a scripting sort of tooling system around Swift. So if you want to write your tools in Swift, you can use Marathon. And that sort of simplifies a bunch of things like dependency management for Swift. So you can, it's yet another dependency management. But you can do things like have your scripts say require a GitHub repo. So if you're dependent on someone else's utility code for your scripting, actually download that, build it, and stash it somewhere. I haven't played with it before. I'm wondering if anyone else has.
Yeah, nice. I do like the idea of having a simpler tool chain.
Doesn't package manager do that for you?
Swift Package Manager? Probably. It may be built on top of that, but I think I haven't heard of it.
Having that would be great because
Yeah.
So looking quickly at the README, it's not like, well, it depends on SPM, so the Swift Package Manager.
Yeah.
So all of your dependencies would need to be dependent on that. Whereas most things you can still easily build in CocoaPods or Carthage. Probably definitely worth looking at if you get completely and utterly frustrated with Fastlane, particularly now that it's owned by Google.
Yeah, from a speed perspective, it might be.
Yeah.
If you're running complicated things and Ruby and that would be good stuff.
yeah, if it was simpler, it'd be great. So this demo project that took me an hour to make is using. So I used Homebrew to install Cherubi and some other things. Then I used Ruby gems to install like CocoaPods and Xcode project, and then I used the NVM to install Node, which installed like some JavaScript dependencies for running my contract tests. So like yay being a polyglot developer and you constantly just managing dependencies. I pip installed the AWS CLI, but I didn't need it for this project. I don't know why that is, but anyway. So the other thing we want to do is, I had some contract tests up and running. I'm a big fan. There's a local tool called Pact, which is written in Melbourne. That's quite advanced contract testing between systems, but it can be a little bit hard to get up and running and a little bit expensive to maintain. So until you have advanced service interactions, and if you're already providing documentation in Swagger, you might be able to get away with it. So I just created a little mocky endpoint. Let's see. Oh yeah, let's do that. So I've got this endpoint Let's curl that. So it just returns. Are you blocking my internet?
No, that should be good.
Oh, I'm blocking it. Another awesome tool. If anyone who works remotely and doesn't use trip mode, it's awesome. So when you tether, it automatically works out your tethering to like a 4G connection and blocks everything from using the internet unless you say it's okay. So when your designers dump like gigabytes of stuff in Dropbox, you don't blow your data plan. So it must have detected that I'm connected to a phone. So I'm just going to turn it off and
Just go to
sync Dropbox. Yeah. So we'll curl that, and it just returns us a really simple JSON blob.
It is syncing Dropbox.
It is. Don't worry. I discovered a little tool called HTTP, not the protocol, a tool, which is kind of like curl, but you don't have to remember all the syntax, and it prints out nicer output. So if you do a lot of stuff on the command line to muck around with APIs, this little HTTP, you brew install HTTP or HTTP IE or something.
Yeah, the HTTP the Python tool.
Yeah, yep. I could have pip installed it probably then. So that's all it returns is just that little JSON blob. It's just a message description title. And so in our Swagger, we basically just define the endpoints for our API. So we just say we get, and it's got a schema, which is an object. It requires the message key to be there, and then it requires a message to satisfy a certain thing. I won't go through all the Swagger stuff. I've had a few talks on Swagger. And then you can give like different object definitions. So this is the schema for a message. It's a JSON object. It requires a title and a description. And then the title is a string, description is a string. So then we can say npm run contract. It's like Ruby gems, but it changes even more often. Sometimes people remove stuff and the whole world breaks. So it's using a tool called Dredd. I think it's available in other languages, but I've only used it in JavaScript. It basically just grabs your Swagger contract. You can run it against an API and it validates the contract against it. So yeah. So it's not nearly as powerful as something like Pact if you're doing proper contract testing, but in terms of just a bit of assurance of like, this is what I expect, or does my API actually validate the documentation that I wrote for it? That's pretty cool. And so if you want to see how, the one thing that's, well, there's lots of things that are crap about it, but one thing that's crap about it is it doesn't give great error messages if it doesn't match. So if we accidentally return something's not, we said the title and description are strings. If we return a number, for example, you'd think that'd never happen, but sometimes people are working on an API and they're like, oh, the ID is always a number. Why do we return it as a string? And they just change it. So if it returns the wrong type, it goes, hey, it didn't match, and here's like a whole bunch of errors.
Yeah, it's the worst.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a sledgehammer. It says like pass or fail. It does go through here and say, look,
You've got to read it.
at message description, invalid type, number, expected string. So the good error message is in there. You just got to look for it.
What's the tool called again?
It's called Dredd.
Dredd.
Dredd. So yeah, under the hood, these npm tasks are literally just running Dredd, the YAML file of our thing, and then the endpoint that we're running against.
When I presented on the Swagger contract stuff that generated your API, your local client, at the same time I was also using Dredd to test the API. Like, so we'd have integration tests that use on one side the iOS client was generated by it, on the other side we're using Dredd. Dredd hit the limits of the Swagger specs so quickly.
Yeah.
It comes back as an int or a string, and it gives you 7 pages of documentation when there's an error.
Yeah.
So
it's better to know something's broken than not, but you also want to be able to resolve it quickly.
But it also doesn't support. Yeah, I found it really frustrating. It's perfect for that simple case.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
As soon as it gets more complicated, it's frustrating.
I agree. So if you get a missing field, you get a similar. So this endpoint basically doesn't return the description, and we said that's required. So again, massive errors, but somewhere it'll say missing required property description. So if we want to make that pass, like we could go into our contract and say, you know what, if the description is there, it needs to be a string, but if it's not there, we don't care. It's not required. So then you could run that again, and hopefully it'll pass. Yeah, that passes. So that was the second tool that I think is that you hit the limits of it. But the fact that you can get it up and running in 5 minutes is really powerful, particularly if you depend on APIs that you don't control and you don't trust the people to tell you when they make breaking changes. Yeah, and it plays in with that Swagger def. So working with Matt and some other people, he's on his phone, but some other people last year, we tried to write an API in Swagger. So the documentation was in Swagger, and then we had a bunch of examples that you can have in Swagger, and we uploaded it to API Gateway, and it made a bunch of mocks based on the examples. So it was our mock API. You can define pass-through endpoints. So we uploaded the Swagger, and it became the real API that actually ran live requests to downstream endpoints and mapped it all through. And then we used Dredd to test the APIs. The API was the mocks, it was the documentation, it was the actual implementation, and it was the contract test, which sounds amazing, but it was really horrible.
And
but
if anyone is wondering, those things constantly fail because people change stuff.
yes, the one good thing is like failing is better than not failing if something breaks. But that experiment of writing an entire API in just YAML is maybe not realistic. Anyway, that was it. There are literally 3 things I had open this afternoon. I would love to hear about the things that you had open this afternoon that help speed up your development process as well. Thanks.
Thanks.